Welcome back if you've taken some time for conversation about textual preaching. In this part, we want to employ our functional definition of textual preaching as we look at four dynamics of textual preaching. Again, here's our working definition. Textual preaching engages a biblical text to the extent that the text itself drives the preparation, structure, content, and texture of the sermon. We'll get practical as we engage the biblical text in four aspects of the preaching task identified in our definition: sermon preparation, structure, content, and texture. We begin with sermon preparation. The impact of textual preaching on a congregation of hearers begins with its impact on the preacher. Crucial here is allowing the text to have its way with us before we presume to apply it to the needs of others. We might call this eating the scroll, remembering how Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the Apostle John were all told to eat the scroll carrying the Lord's revelation. They may have actually munched on the goat skin and taken it down. For us, it's more like the words of the old collect. We read, mark, learn, and inwardly digest the text. The idea here is that the message and the messenger are inseparable. The preacher has taken the text into his own needs, and then he emerges from his time of textual contemplation with, of all things, the makings of a sermon. A text fully engaged in preparation will lead to a text fully engaged in composition and presentation. Now, here are some aspects of preparation emphasizing the primary functions of the text. These are not necessarily steps in preparation, but aspects of preparation with the biblical text fully engaged. First, the preacher reads the text aloud. Biblical texts were written to be read aloud. It may even be true that reading a text silently was not considered normal for the first 1,000 years of Christianity. To meditate on a text was to speak the text aloud and contemplate its meaning. Hearing oneself read a text over and over alerts one to its language, moods, and movement. Preaching, after all, is oral communication. Second, in engaging the text in preparation, the preacher brings his own needs to the text, or to say it better, the preacher allows the text to speak to his own struggles. Luther called this tentatio or anfechtung. The preacher reads the text aloud, making connections between the text and his own life. Then, using the language of the text, he prays the text and its meanings back to God. These prayers, I believe, are best spoken aloud as well, and in themselves begin building a bridge between text and hearer, in this case between text and preacher. The language and movement of these first prayers in response to a text are often seedlings for the language and movement of a sermon. If this text is not just a text, but the very Word of God, praying the text brings God into the process of preparation and marks the preacher as one who has not only spent time with the text, but the one who inspired it in the first place. Strong sermons are born of this relationship between the preacher and his Lord. Third, preachers contemplate a text with their hearers in mind. Preachers may approach this differently. The persuasive preacher may be looking toward a goal for the hearer, which, as Dr. Richard Kemmerer wrote in his seminal work, Preaching the Word, could be a faith goal or a life goal. The transformational preacher may consider how the text could move his hearers from one point to another. Thomas Long, in his book, Preaching from Memory to Hope, builds on the work of Paul Ricoeur, suggesting that biblical texts are really intended to change lives. So preachers in preparation look for how a text might reorder or refigure our lives, all based on the actual language of the text itself. Life before a text is chaotic and threatening or unsatisfying. This Ricoeur calls prefiguration, the world behind a text. The text comes along and presents a configured life, ordered, satisfying in some way, a preferred life. And in front of that configured text is the refigured life of the listener, transformed by the truth and power of the biblical text. If this sounds a bit like Law and Gospel recast, I understand. Transformational preachers are always looking for the before and after narratives informed by a text. Certainly what the text first meant to its original hearers matters, as does its original context. Historical and literary contexts matter. Our exegetical work also engages the text this way, but more important is living in the text itself with a pastoral heart for the meaning it carries for our listeners. Living in the text is the fourth aspect of preparation which keeps the text engaged. Here the preacher pays attention to many facets of the written text. First, we look for the language in the text which carries great freight for preaching. We find words or phrases which will become the content of our preaching. More specifically, we look for visual language in the text. We ask, in what ways does this text engage the imagination? This is seeing a text, and it's crucial in sermon preparation. Strong oral communication calls for strong visual language, engaging the listener's imagination. We usually don't have to work too hard at this if we watch for the images portrayed in our biblical text. We're looking here for the textual language which will become the language of our sermon, and in many ways the images of the sermon in the hearer's imagination. We also look for the structure inherent in the text. How does the text move, and what does this suggest for the movement and structure for a sermon? Textual preaching, as we'll see in what's ahead, often simply adopts the movement of the text. Lutheran preachers are always looking in a text for law and gospel. How does this specific text expose human sin, death, temptation, finitude, separation, or guilt? Where do I see the human conditions of being bound or burdened or broken? And then we ask, in what way is the gospel the antidote for the sinful condition of humanity depicted in the text? It's crucial here that we use the language of the text for both law and gospel, rather than a rote, generic, or formulaic expression of the gospel. Clearly, every text doesn't explicitly carry a law and gospel dynamic, so it's here that we look for what Francis Rosso has called handles. Words or phrases which take us to parallel texts. In other words, we import law or gospel when necessary. Even here, though, this text must be heard. As we prepare, we also ask, in what ways is Christ central in this text? We preach Christ crucified, the Apostle Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 1. Him we proclaim, he writes in Colossians 1. So we ask, what does the person of Christ bring to this text? How is he crucial? In what sense does the text stand or fall on Christ alone? This is not an ethereal Christ we're after here, but the Christ of history, the Christ still heaped deep in our world. For years, I've been blessed by Lucas Cranach's 1547 depiction of Luther preaching with one hand on the text of the Scriptures and the other pointing to the crucified Christ in the center of the congregation. Only recently did I notice that the cross of Christ in the midst of preacher and congregation in that painting actually casts a shadow. Cranach gives us a real historical Christ and a real historical cross. These Christological questions are crucial in sermon preparation. So far, we've said that as the textual preachers prepare, they look in the text for language, especially visual language, movement and transition, law and gospel, and Christology. Now let's continue. As we prepare, we also look for a central thought in the text. We wonder, what central meaning of this text provides a homiletical center for my sermon? Speaking from a linear perspective, what unifying thread of meaning from this text will run throughout my sermon to give it strong, organic unity? Crucial here is a central thought. We also look for enhancements suggested by the text. What stories, analogies, examples, metaphors come to mind as we contemplate the text? These may be from the Scriptures or from our own experience or that of our hearers. As we prepare, we're also sensitive to the mood of the text. There may be more than one mood. There may be mood swings in a text, as often the case in the Psalms. We ask, what does the mood of the text or the variety of moods suggest for my preaching? And finally, in preparation, we look at other texts which clarify or intensify the meaning of the text before us. We ask, what parallel texts in the Bible support this text and its meanings? This matrix of parallel texts will serve to amplify and exemplify the sermon text, but hopefully will never become a distraction or take us on a path leading away from our text. As you can see, we have a lot of listening to do with the text before we preach it. As a text engages us in preparation, we're listening for language, especially visual language. movement and transition, law and gospel, Christology, a central thought or meaning, enhancements, moods, and parallel texts. I'll take a moment now, if you like, to pause and spend some time talking about our engagement of a scriptural text in preparing a sermon.